Jer si milostivi čovekoljubi Bog i tebi slavu uznosimo, Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, sada i uvek i u vekove vekova.
In a world of shadows and secrets untold, where primeval stories make the brave go cold, mighty gods on high and realms below, whispers of legends that shape each soul. And nightmarish dreams, cryptids lurking, nothing's as it seems, giants walking, angels and demons fight, only truth can bring the light. Through the echoes of time the tales unfold, mysteries arise as the prophecies are foretold, from valiant knights to buried treasure, this podcast brings nothing but pleasure. Welcome to myth, mysteries and majesty. Exploiting enigmas hidden from our sight. Archaeologists make excavations deep of the ancient tombs where pharaohs sleep. In the dust of ages we chronicles keep, storytelling's power of monsters that creep. Myth, mysteries and majesty is the place for you to learn about this haunted space. From scholarship to manuscripts of old, unlock the secrets of wisdom and gold.
Who and what is Satan? What is his origin? What are his names, roles, and what are biblical sources that we'll be using for tonight in this podcast? And moreover, even some of the apocrypha, the text that didn't make it to the Old Testament canon yet, is crucial when it comes to the Jewish tradition. So welcome to episode 207. For tonight, I have a new guest with us, Ben. Ben, can we please start by you introducing yourself to the audience, maybe what church you go to, and then start telling us something about the Substack. And surprise, surprise, you also wrote in great lengths when it comes to Satan by using some of the scholarly sources.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it, Nick. It's really meaningful to me. I go to an Anglican church. I am a layperson in the Anglican Church of North America. I was just confirmed a few months ago, and my life has been such an interesting journey. I started writing in earlier this year, and I started writing about the Puritans and the Catholic mystical tradition and about things I'm reading in biblical scholarship. I have an article right now I'm working on about time, and it's going to be drawing from Augustine and biblical scholarship and Eastern Orthodox scholars and just like all kinds of stuff. It's going to be fun. I'm really into liturgical Christianity. I'm really into ecumenical work within Christianity, within the body of Christ. That's what I'm really excited about right now. And that's kind of the telos of my Substack, I guess, is just church and Bible and bridging gaps between different places. That's a big thing for me. Like I mentioned, my first article was about, I guess you didn't really ask me about my first article, but it was about the Puritan John Owen and the Carmelite Catholic monk John of the Cross, and bridging a gap between the two of them. And then, so the article that you had me on for was about was this thing where I was reading Michael Heiser and John Walton, and I was reading Rabbi David Foreman, who was just wonderful. And they all kind of had these different ideas of how they look at the Genesis narrative, Genesis chapter 3, with the fall of man. And I was noticing that there's kind of a commonality between these different interpretations. When you read Rabbi David Foreman, he does a really good job of, in his book, The Beast That Crouches at the Door, he does a really good job of showing how the serpent is this beast of the field that's presenting himself as a human being, almost, where he's almost usurping the role of Adam, and where he's kind of, speaking as if he's a person, you know what I mean? And that's really weird, because only God and people speak in general, right? And then I read Dr. Michael Heiser, and I read how how the serpent was this, the text implicitly describes him as this angelic figure, and as this, and the serpent is kind of more than what he seems. There's this language of, the word can also be described as a divinizer, like someone who does divinization, and he's like divinizing divine information to Eve, and there's all kinds of stuff. And I was reading John Walton and how the serpent is kind of connected to this larger chaos motif in the scripture, and I just found that there's this common thread of liminality between spaces. So and Satan in Genesis chapter 3, he's kind of he's bridging the gaps, but not exactly in the same way I'm trying to bridge gaps. And he is basically presenting himself as a beast of the field, but he's also a divine being, but he's also like acting like a person. And the text is begging the question, what does it mean to be human, right? And so there's so much to that, and it's so much fun. And that's kind of the article that you read, that you were like, hey, let's get this guy on the podcast. And so I appreciate that. I guess to finish introducing myself, that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm 20 years old. I'm just trying to read as much as I can, and I'm trying to learn about Christian spirituality and biblical interpretation and biblical theology, historical theology, and modern biblical exegesis, and just trying to bridge gaps between all of them. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction and for giving us the context when it comes to especially that article that you wrote and sources that you draw from giants such as Walton and Heiser. And yeah, it is true. Many times on the podcast with different guests, we did cover about the chaos narrative in Genesis, especially Genesis 1, then the chaos dragon monster called Leviathan, what it represents. We covered Spencer Owen, who is a Christian therapist, but he also loves biblical theology. Him and I covered in 2 different podcasts this Eastern Orthodox biblical theology book. I think it's called
Lord of the Spirits.
Lord of Spirits. I was about to say Lord of Hosts. Yeah, Lord of Spirits. So it's a really phenomenal and easy to understand biblical theology book that we couldn't just cover in one podcast, so we did it in 2. And there, Father Damick explains. He explains in great length cosmic problem and cosmic problem of chaos that God was supposedly wrestling with. And when I was reading Father Damick, I was like, this is like John Walton, like what Heiser are saying, more or less in the same way. So just confirm what you just said, and also what we've been covering in a number of episodes about Chaos Monster, and like, hey, well, Leviathan, the great serpent, is also portrayed as a chaos monster, and the devil is also portrayed as the dragon. Could there be any connection? And there probably are, but we are told only what we are told. There's so much we don't know. But I always appreciate scholarship when, especially when they can give us more, dots to connect to get a bigger picture and see how, biblical theology from Genesis to Revelation is way more beautiful, complex, and deep. And it doesn't matter and I love what you said at the beginning how you're seeing this ecumenical connections between churches is something important and beautiful. And I remember growing in a Pentecostal church, you always hear this boogeyman of like, oh, no to ecumenical systems and alliance because, these are idolaters, these are not our brothers and sisters. But like learning from all these other authors, including Eastern Orthodox priests, I'm like, how is this different than what we're learning from evangelical scholars like Walton and Heiser?
Yeah.
So it is, while it is certainly good to be on guard, I also see a lot of bias and fear of the unknown. Like just because these are people from different churches and we believe different things when it comes to the Bible, especially the gospel, stay away from them. But there's no reason for us to stay away and not learn from brothers and sisters. But yeah.
I was just going to say a few things. As far as the ecumenical thing goes, yeah, totally. I mean, there are things that I see in our Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters that it's like these people have Jesus and these people value the gospel. And I'm more confirmed into like why I'm a Protestant at the same time when I read it. Because I do read some things and I'm like, I don't mean to be too controversial, but I do read some things and I'm like, I don't think that's supported by the Bible, and I don't think that's a proper way we look at the Virgin Mary or something like that. But I don't think that means we can just throw the baby out with the bathwater or act like these people don't make up vast swaths of Christendom, right? Because, I mean, frankly, there are problematic things about all areas of Christianity, right? And so I view that as really important. Also, you were talking about the chaos thing, right? Something I address in my article that I think plays into this is the sense of liminality and the sense of chaos. Chaos has this inherent connection to breaching creation order, is something I talk about in my article, right? Like there's this, it's entropy, it's pushing boundaries, right? And what I kind of wrote about here is that in art, in the way that we think about the satanic in art, it inherently has to do with chaos, because you have these or when you look at medieval art of Satan or something like that, right? You see all these creatures amalgam together. There's the sense of liminality and the sense of chaos in medieval art of Satan, right? Or in modern film. When you look at satanic figures, there's this emphasis on androgyny, like in The Passion of the Christ. Or even you might think of the movie Psycho, where Norman Bates is caught between this Oedipal figure of his mother and himself, and it's like it's crossing these boundaries. Or the Joker in The Dark Knight, that was another one where he is this chaos creature, right? And he's like this force. And these crossing boundaries and these bringing in entropy and chaos is how we think about it and what we see in the Bible, because all of these falls that we see in the Bible have to do with the crossing of boundaries, right? Genesis 3 is the crossing of boundaries, as I said before. You might think of Lot and his daughters. You might think of Abraham and his sons. You might think of the Nephilim, right? The sons of God, the daughters of men, which we'll talk about later. All these have to do with the crossing of creation boundaries. And I think that's really how we should address the idea of the satanic and how we do theology, is liminality and boundary and chaos pushing, as opposed to the God who brings everything together into created order.
Yeah, I have a question before we start dissecting this book for tonight. Have you heard, he's my Facebook friend, really wonderful and really wise guy, Pastor Josh Robinson. He wrote this book. We dissected both of this on the podcast, Re-enchanting the Unseen and Re-enchanting Time. I was thinking about him because you just mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you like thinking and writing about time. These two books are very affordable. They are short also, but these are very beneficial and I mean, as deep as you can go in 100 pages each. But I think they will be good for you since you like these things. I mean, Re-enchanting the Unseen is basically the Divine Council worldview. But because you mentioned the time, we were talking about his book, and he also writes Substack and other else where he writes more theological articles. This book is also where he, besides other things, he compares with Riverdale and that special place of the of God's presence, which will be almost like a spiritual oasis. So we talked about his book and some other stuff that will be connected with Re-Enchanted Time. So I think this will be a decent book for you to get and learn from, and maybe even draw information in your further writing. I just wanted to show you this. That's the advertisement for my friend. Can you please tell us what's your Substack address, even though I have included it so people will know and they can subscribe?
I'll have to look at. Honestly, I'll have to look at it real quick if you don't mind. I think it's just my name. Okay. Yeah, it's just at Ben Stacey 1 is all it is. It's nothing real crazy. That's cool about the time thing. I very briefly, because I know we have to get started. I'm really into the re-enchantment right now. It's very in vogue, and like I'm thinking about that, and everybody is. And so that's really cool. My next article I'm working on, it's going to be drawing this line from kind of the problem of time, which is chaos and entropy. That's the problem of time, right? Is entropy playing out in space. And then I'm going to draw that into the Genesis 1 and the Torah and Leviticus and how all these solve the problem of time via solving the problem of space as well.
Can I give one suggestion?
It's going to be a whole thing. It's going to be cool. Excited.
Can I give one suggestion?
Yeah.
Maybe include the gap theory.
We'll consider it. It's not something I hold to personally, but it's
as a
something
potential, as a possibility, it opens doors to more stuff. Yeah. Anyway,
I'm excited to think about that and think about how Christianity solves time. But anyway, I don't want to keep going on that. I was just trying to kind of explain what I hope to do next.
So for tonight, Ben and I will be talking about this book, Satan, How God's Executioner Became the Enemy. This is a book that Dr. Ryan Stokes wrote 6 years ago, and it's a book that is a little bit pricey, $45, but it's a scholarly book, and it goes all the way from Old to New Testament, including apocrypha such as First Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and some other sources, going through basically the evolution of theology when it comes to God's archenemy, the Satan. And why is it important that this is the Satan? Well, because, surprise, surprise to many people, the Bible mentions many Satans, but usually one, the Satan. So in a way that, for example, if this helps the audience, when Jesus called Peter, "Stand behind me, Satan." So Peter was in that regard, in that context, he was a Satan, but not the Satan. Why was he a Satan? Because he was opposing God's will. He was almost acting as God's enemy in that way, in that context, but not as the enemy, not as the Satan. So again, this is a really good book written by a solid scholar, published by a very famous publishing Christian company. It's not like, oh, I saw this online, it's weird, and it's from some podcast or a blog. No, this is coming from a real scholar. So again, this is the book that we'll be covering for tonight. And I also included the Amazon link for the audience if you guys want to buy it. So let's start from the very beginning. We'll be dissecting first 5 chapters because we simply won't have time to talk about 8 chapters tonight. So when it comes to the first chapter, which is titled The Origin of Satan, basically biblical scholars arrived at a general consensus when it comes to the origin and evolution of a tradition of Satan and everything that comes around him. The hypothesis is that development regarding Satan came in 3 stages, and these three stages are connected with 3 main passages in the Old Testament. The earliest text to speak of a heavenly Satan figure is found in Numbers 22, when Prophet Balaam was confronted by the angel of Yahweh. So we know the story when Balaam was forcing his donkey to go to continue riding, but the donkey was disobedient because the donkey had the ability to notice the angel, and it was scared, while Balaam was not able to see because his spiritual eyes were blinded. So although this passage uses the Hebrew word Satan, it is not the name Satan as it would later become. So, and this may come surprising to some people, but this is basically what the Bible is telling us. It is merely a common noun meaning adversary. So this is what the word Satan means. It means adversary or maybe obstacle. And this Satan was not God's enemy, at least not in this context, but was none other than the angel of Yahweh himself. And now we know from, well, scholars disagree here, but usually the angel of Yahweh or the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament mentioned is understood by many scholars to be Jesus Christ himself. So this will be the examples, the Old Testament examples and passages when it comes to Christophany. So the examples where Jesus would be shown to many Old Testament saints, prophets usually, in the Old Testament before the incarnation, before he came in flesh. So again, this may come as a surprise, but the angel of the Lord, not an angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord was called a Satan. Why? Because he was acting as an adversary or even possibly an obstacle to prophet Balaam, who was not listening to God and not obeying God. So the angel of God was opposing Balaam, thus being his adversary or a Satan, not the Satan. So when it comes in next to passages that show us the development or the evolution of the Satan tradition, Ben, we are jumping to Job chapters 1 and 2 and Zechariah 3. Can you just help us just summarize what are these two passages telling us and how do they differ or how they're similar to what we already read in Numbers 22?
Yeah. So my understanding is that, sorry, give me 1 second. Yeah, with Job, I think that with Job you see a distinct character within God's counsel acting as an accuser within the council, whereas what you see in Numbers is actually describing the angel of the Lord, which many scholars, like you said, have thought to be God himself, because frankly the text refers to the angel of the Lord as God himself, right? So one is the angel of the Lord going forth and doing something, acting as an opposition to evil. And then Job, for instance, that's the passage I'm more familiar with, but Job, for instance, is a member of God's divine counsel looking for a person who is righteous and not a sinner to accuse and inflict judgment on. So there's a difference here in who's doing it and the context of what kind of a person it's being done to, right?
Okay. Yeah. So in Job 1 and 2, it's not anymore Satan like in Numbers 22, but now it's Hasatan, which brings that the article in Hebrew, which now tells us, well, this is different Satan compared to Numbers 22, because in Numbers 22 is a Satan. But now we see that Job 1 and 2 and Zechariah 3 are speaking about Hasatan, so the Satan. So although Satan was not yet, did not yet become a name, these text marks they show a significant step to the tradition in that direction, in that the word Satan is used not simply as a common noun, but as a title for an officer in God's court. So this is what Ben was saying. Imagine God's counsel, God's heavenly counsel, and now read Job 1 and 2. You see that Satan had ability and allowance to approach God's throne and the divine counsel without any fear or without any hindrance. So this was back then. Now we know that's not happening anymore. But serving as almost an officer in his court, he was able to come and approach God. So the final stage in the evolution of this Satan tradition, according to at least most of the scholars, is attested by the census story of 1 Chronicle 21. And this is one of those controversial topics, or at least passages, which uses
a weird story.
It is a weird story because there are two different accounts of the same story, right? And this is why. In 1 Chronicles 22, there's the noun Satan without the definite article. But in the later text, in this late text, the chronicler did not speak of a Satan as he did in Numbers 22, or of the Satan as in Job and Zechariah, but of one named Satan. So here it's almost like Satan is getting is becoming a name, even though before that it wasn't a name, it was a title. It was like if I would say I'm an officer, or you're a student, or someone is a mother or a father. So you have a role to play, but that's not your name. So this chronicler, he alleviated the theological problem created by 2 Samuel 24, in which Yahweh incites David to take this census of Israel by substituting Satan for Yahweh as the instigator of the census. But finally, in the latest of these biblical texts to speak of a superhuman Satan, one reads of a figure resembling the Satan of later Jewish and Christian literature. By the time of Chronicles, Satan was apparently the name of an evil heavenly being who leads humanity into sin. So it was easy to see how the belief that a superhuman being might serve as a Satan was transformed into a belief that there was a particular malevolent superhuman being named Satan. So why is this important? It may be too technical for some people. So that's why I'm also encouraging people buy the book. It will become easier if you're highlighting or underlining, making pauses, breaks, thinking about this. But I don't know. Imagine someone calls me, I don't know. Imagine someone says, kind. I wish people says I'm kind. They don't say that often, but let's say I'm a kind person. People say it often. Eventually, if people know me as a kind person, they may call me, oh, here's that kind person, without speaking my name. So if people who know me just substitute my name, or they don't know me, but someone's pointing, like, yeah, that's that kind person we were talking about, that can almost become as my second name, because by my attribute, or by my character trait, or by my role, or let's say I'm an officer, I'm a lawyer. If they say, oh, that's the lawyer, if I'm coming from a certain lawyer group or a company, or if I'm representing myself, and that's my role, what I'm doing, I'm defending you on the court, well, that almost becomes as my second name. That's the lawyer, even if you don't remember my name, but suddenly my role becomes my name. So that's what we're seeing here, that Satan, or the entity that we call Satan, because honestly, we don't know his real name. We call him Lucifer, we call him the devil, we call him Satan, we call him, as we'll find out soon, Mastema, we call him Belial. But I don't think, and scholars are saying the same, that we actually don't know his real name. He later picks up all these names based on the character traits and the roles he's playing. Like soon we'll find out if he's an executioner, or also accusing people. So in that way, he's doing this work of a Satan being opposer. But if is that his real name? We don't know. So basically, that's how the book starts by Dr. Stokes. He's basically going through the evolution of several of these passages in the Old Testament where, not every a Satan was the Satan. Moreover, the Satan, or just Satan, is not necessarily his name.
If I could add real quick. If I could add real quick, I think you'd probably agree with me that we could think of the term Christ in a similar way, right? So Jesus is the Christ, like he's the ultimate Christ, right? But then there are other Christ figures, because the word Christ just means anointed one, right? You know what I mean? It's a term used to describe a person that we've then given to be what we call the person. You know what I mean? I think, would you say that's a pretty accurate kind of parallel?
Yeah. I don't know if I thought about Christ in that way, but yeah, he's the Christ, because even if there are many Christs, many anointed people to do God's will, there's only one anointed divine person of the Godhead. There is the Christ, and then here I would put capital C. But for little Christs or little messiahs, in a way that we are following God's will, doing God's will, being anointed, being filled with the Holy Spirit. Just like Paul said, we are imitating Christ. So in that way, by being Christ ambassadors, we're being little Christ Christians, right? Little Christ. So yeah, I can understand that. But there's only one, the Satan, just like there's one Christ, the divine figure. Switching to the next subchapter, Dr. Stokes is asking a very good question. He says, well, what? Not who, but he's saying what is a Satan? And then he goes to explain. He says, Well, with the possible exception of 1 Chronicles 21, the Hebrew scriptures do not use the word Satan as a name. Again, this just backs up what I just said 2 minutes ago, but simply as a common noun. While scholars have suggested various translations for Satan, until recently the overwhelming majority have agreed that it should be translated as adversary, and more specifically in legal context as accuser. At the conclusion of the heavenly battle described in Revelation 12, in which Satan and his angels are defeated and thrown out of heaven, John hears a loud voice proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser, ho kategor, ho is the, of our comrades or of our brothers, have been thrown out. Who accuses, ho kategoron." So again, this is we switch from Hebrew to Greek, and that ho, just like ha in Hebrew, would be the. So this person accuses them day and night before God, and this is in Revelation 12:10. By the latter part of the first century CE, Satan had come to be regarded as the accuser of the brethren. And again, we are seeing this evolution of the text and theology by revelation. The noun Satan is used to describe several different individuals in the Hebrew scriptures. Most of the persons referred to as Satans or as Satans in the Hebrew scriptures are, surprise, surprise, human beings. And while it is not entirely incorrect to characterize these persons as adversaries, this characterization fails to convey the precise nature of these adversaries' activity. So maybe, Ben, you can tell us what happened in 1 Samuel 29:4 when David again was on the run from King Saul, but he has aligned himself temporarily with the Philistines for protection. How can this text help us when it comes, to understand what would be the role of a human Satan?
Right. And so, so during that story, the leaders, of course, send David away, and they fear that the Israelite warrior would betray them in battle, killing Philistine soldiers in order to win back Saul's favor. And so the commander of the Philistines says to send the man back so that he may return to the place that you have assigned to him, and he shall not go down with us in battle, or so he may become a Satan to us in battle. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? And so we see a kind of national military attacker that also may have been kind of more in mind in 1 Kings 5, which describes the early part of Solomon's reign as a king of peace, in which there is neither Satan or opposition or of some sort, nor misfortune, right? But then later, on account of Solomon's involvement with the worship of foreign gods, the Lord, our God, raises up Hadad the Edomite and a marauder by the name of Rezon as Satans, who are foreign enemies who attack Solomon and Israel.
Yeah. So as the audience can hear, these are perfect examples. Again, found in 1 Samuel 29:4, but again is in 1 Kings 5:18 or 1 Kings 11:14, where people are called Satans. Why? Because they're not the Satan, but they're simply serving as you're opposing someone. So let's say Ben and I, you and I have an argument, and you're saying, well, I'm going to clean my room today, and I'm like, no, man, you can't clean the room because I have to study. And let's say we're roommates or we're brothers and we live together. I'm like, you can't clean the room because I need to study and I need peace and quiet. And you're like, no, I had for today to clean. And I'm like, no, I have time to study. I have deadline. So in that way, I'm opposing you. So in the proper context, I would serve as your Satan, not military Satan, not Lucifer, Satan, the devil. I would simply be someone opposing you because you had an agenda, you had an idea for today, to clean the room, but I'm like, no, I need peace and quiet so I can study. You'll clean tomorrow or in 2 days. So I'm opposing your plan. So we're just giving this context so that people will see that not every Satan, or in Hebrew, Satan, would be the Satan, the guy with horns and long tail. Of course, he doesn't look that way, but this is how he's usually portrayed in the movies. But there's a different story given in 2 Samuel 19, especially in verse 23. We see that here Satan in this passage is someone who would attack and kill another person. 2 Samuel 19 differs from the passages considered above in that this attack is supposed, at least by Abishai, to be justified by Shimei's crime. So Abishai suggests that Shimei may be punished capitally for his crime, so that Satan in this passage would be an executioner. Okay, so now there's this person, Satan, that is just doing his job of an executioner. He's not portrayed as an evil person here. Another word that has bearing on this discussion is the verb stn, which occurs in few psalms. Although translators often use this verb as to accuse, this word, like its noun Satan, more likely denotes a lethal physical attack. The psalm says, for example, in Psalm 71:13, "Let those who attack me be put to shame and consumed. Let those who seek me hurt to be covered with scorn and disgrace." In Psalm 109, verse 29, it uses the verb in the same fashion. "May my attackers be clothed with dishonor. May they be wrapped in their own shame as in a mantle." In each of these texts, the psalmist asks for God's support against human attackers who seek his life. So here are human satans or satans who are serving as executors. So I may be coming after you because, let's say, again, man, it's always me coming after you, Ben. So I'm sorry for giving you as the example, but let's say you gossip about me, and you added something more than what actually happened. And because I'm so vain and because I cannot forgive you, I'm actually running after you to hurt you, to harm you, or maybe to even take your life, right? Because it's my reputation. I care about it. So I'm coming to execute you. So if we would compare this story to what happened, like I said, in this couple of Psalms, I'll be the one executing. You're trying to executing. So in that context, I'm your Satan. I'm your Satan. But I have nothing to do as a human executioner. I have nothing to do with the Satan, Lucifer, the God's archenemy, even though the same word is used as a noun. So that's why it's very good to give these examples to people to know that, hey, if someone was called Satan, just like Peter was called Satan by Jesus, that doesn't mean you're serving Lucifer, the devil, say the Satan. It just means you're opposing someone, you're accusing someone, or you're about to execute someone because that may be your job or role. Before we switch now to Numbers 22, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think maybe, I don't think the word, like the Hebrew word for the Satan, is used in this context, but this might be a really good classic example rather than just you and me. So in the story of Cain and Abel, right, Cain is being a Satan to Abel. That's not, I don't think that's actually used in the text, but that would be an example where that would be relevant. You know what I mean? I just wanted to point that out real quick. I don't have any other thoughts other than that. That was just something I thought might be a helpful example.
Yeah, that's a good example because even though that word is not used in the passage, that's, I believe, Genesis 4, but that would be a good example. So when we switch to Numbers 22, we saw that already there's this superhuman being called as a Satan in Numbers 22. In this passage, the Israelites set up camp on these plains of Moab and their ways to the promised land. When Balak, king of Moab, learns of the Israelites' presence, he worries that the encroaching multitude will sap the territory's resources, and he summons the prophet Balaam to curse the Israelites. Although Balaam initially refuses the king's invitation, he eventually accepts and sets out by the donkey for Moab. And we already told about this story because God became angry with Balaam. So the angel of the Lord took his stand in the road as his Satan. So this angel of the Lord is not the fallen that we call Lucifer, the fallen angel. No, this is God's holy angel executing God's will, doing God's purpose because God told him to do so. And God always does righteous things, holy things. So by this angel obeying God's will, he himself is also being righteous and holy because he's doing what God told him to do. So in this way, he is Prophet Balaam's Satan, a Satan, but not the Satan. And we don't have to dwell on this story because, like I said, we already covered this. So switching to the next subchapter, the Satan was rebuked by the angel of Yahweh in Zechariah. So this text that we just briefly mentioned at the beginning mentions another superhuman Satan in the Hebrew scriptures, again in Zechariah 3. And until recently, scholars have generally agreed that the Satan in this passage is the accuser who accuses high priest Joshua before the angel of Yahweh. Some scholars, including this book author, however, understand that Satan in this text is not an accuser, but as the one who will attack and kill Joshua. Modern interpreters agree that this passage does not contain the name Satan. So again, it's not his name, it's just his role. Rather, Ha-Satan is a title, the Satan. Like if I would be the lawyer, the podcaster, that's not my name. So Ha-Satan would be simply the Satan. Zechariah's this entity of Satan, understood in this way, is not simply a superhuman being who happens on this occasion to be serving as a Satan, as in Numbers 22, but he's an officer in the divine court whose title is the Satan. So he doesn't say he's evil. And he doesn't say this officer is the same archenemy, the great serpent of all who's deceiving people and who is condemned. It doesn't say that's the same enemy. It doesn't say that. So this Satan, or the Satan depicted here in Zechariah 3, is a heavily prosecuting attorney who has set his sights on eliciting a guilty verdict against Joshua in the divine courtroom. The passage merely states that the Satan is standing on Joshua's right in order to Satan him, to attack him, to accuse him. Translators and commentators have mistakenly supposed that Satan and Satan refer to accusation and have interpreted the passage accordingly. And this may be helpful that in Psalm 109, verse 6, is commonly taught to describe a legal procedure very similar to that of Zechariah 3, even though it's a little bit different scenario. And like Zechariah 3, this verse speaks of a Satan standing on someone's right. And I'll read it. So again, Psalm 109, 6-9. Appoint a wicked man against him. Let a Satan stand on his right. When he disputes, let wickedness transpire. Let his prayer result only in sin. May his days be few. May another seize his position. May his children be orphans and his wife a widow. Sounds like a curse psalm. So again, this is Psalm 109. Not only does the usage of Satan and Satan elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures lead one to expect these words to pertain in some sort of attack in Zechariah 3, but the translations execute and executioner, respectively, are supposed contextually within Zechariah 3. So Zechariah sees the Satan standing on Joshua's right to attack him. Joshua is no innocent victim, however, since he stands guilty before the angel of Yahweh. And since the Satan's attack on Joshua's life seems to be justified, the Satan here should be understood as a divine executioner, similar to the one whom Balaam encountered on his way to Moab in Numbers 22. Very interesting. Again, this entity here is not called to be evil one, but simply doing his job. So the interaction between the angel of Yahweh, Joshua, and the Satan closely resembles that which took place between David, Shimei, and Abishai in 2 Samuel 19. In the Samuel text, the criminal Shimei appears before the king, and Abishai stands ready to execute him. So we'll skip this Zechariah 3 passage, and we'll talk about the next subchapter, which is the Satan who stands against Israel in 1 Chronicles 21. Do you want to tell us or summarize how we can see the Satan in this passage?
There was something I wanted to say real quick, if you don't mind. Two things. One, something that the book talks about a lot is the book makes mention that the Satan figures, the opposing figures here, and how this book and how the Old Testament Hebrew uses the word Satan, not how we would use the word Satan, right? Or the satanic. But in these instances, there's always a physical nature to it. That's something that the book mentioned. Another thing I wanted to say real quick before I get into this, because these were just on my mind as we were talking. Another thing I wanted to say real quick is that I don't think we can say for sure whether or not the Satan figure. Now, if it's the angel of the Lord, of course it's like God himself. You know what I mean? Or at the very least, a good guy on God's side, right? But with some of these other instances, we don't know for sure if it's a Satan figure who's acting as an opposer or the Satan himself. We don't know that for sure. I don't want to, personally to me, I want to make it clear that we don't necessarily know either way. So we don't. I personally don't want to assert in either direction or the other, but both are open. It could either be a completely different person who's also a divine being, or it could be the divine being that we know as the Satan, right? I just want to say that real quick. I hope that's helpful. That was just on my mind. But you were asking about 1 Chronicles 21. Is that right? All right. So 1 Chronicles 21 is this very strange story, and it's paralleled in 2 Samuel as well. But it's where the Satan or a Satan appears to King David and asks for a census of the nation of Israel. And what's really fascinating is that, so outside of 1 Chronicles 21, the only passage in all the Hebrew Bible that speaks of a superhuman Satan simply as a Satan, as opposed to the Satan, is Numbers 22. And so, but here, given the numerous ways in which the census story, especially the version in Chronicles, mirrors the Balaam narrative, which there's apparently like several ways in which that happens. The Satan of 1 Chronicles 21 should be understood similarly to that of Numbers 22, because there's such parallels between the two passages. There's a superhuman attacker, or more specifically, someone who's acting as an executioner for God. And nothing in the story suggests that this Satan is necessarily an accuser figure, because there's no courtroom scene like we would see in Job, and this Satan does not bring charges against anyone, and he doesn't appear to act as a tempting figure. Again, this is very different from how we would think of Satan in other contexts, right? Because this is likely not the same being as we're looking at in other contexts, right? So what we find here is that the Satan in 1 Chronicles doesn't fit with really what we see in the later Satan tradition. And of course, this Satan in this passage does seem to incite David to sin, but not really for the sake of encouraging sin, let alone in an act of rebellion against God. It is because the Satan, as God's agent of death, intends to slay thousands of people in Israel. The opening statement in the passage says, "A Satan stood up against Israel." Israel. It's not opposing the specific person of David like we'd see in Job. Rather, it's opposing a whole people group, Israel, right? And although the activity of the Satan in Chronicles is not limited to the simple physical act of attacking Israel, again, I mentioned the physicality of these attacks, inciting David to sin is merely the means to that end in this particular instance. The Satan who incites David seems to be acting on God's behalf here as one of God's agents of one of his divine counsel, which is difficult to say the least. It provides some difficult interpretation things we have to do, but that seems to be what the text indicates.
Yeah, thanks for that. So basically, like you said, it's hard to decipher always, and and to exegete, especially when we have a slightly different story told in different passages. And as we know, in some passages, it says that it was a Satan who was inciting David, but in another example, it was mentioning God. The traditional reading of First Chronicles 21:1 holds that the Satan in this verse is Satan with capital S, right? Who would be God's arch nemesis, right? Enemy number one. As in later Jewish and Christian tradition, the redactor, he removed or he exchanged Satan for God in order to resolve the theological difficulty of attributing David's sin and the resulting calamity to the work of God. While this interpretation would explain the Chronicles' editorial adjustment, Jewish writings from long time after the time of Chronicles continue to speak of the Satan figure as an agent of God, not as God's adversary. For example, in Jubilees chapter 10. By all indications outside this passage, the Jews did not arrive at the belief that Satan was God's rival until a much later period. So again, here we're dealing with editors, here we're dealing with difficulties of the text, here we're dealing with, well, was it Satan, was it God, and was the early text showing God, and then the later text, is changed to be Satan to explain people that it's actually someone else but God, guilty for something like this. And we'll deal with this in some other chapters as well. So in First Chronicles 21, again, we're speaking about terrestrial military Satan, who would fit the context of the consensus in this passage. With the possibility of war happening around them, a king might find it necessary to take inventory of his fighting force. But the problem with this interpretation is that it will be strange for a military opponent to incite David to take a census. This word normally depicts an act of persuasion or seduction. It would not likely be used to describe a military threat to which someone responds by numbering his troops. So some scholars have suggested that the Satan in one of David's advisors is one of David's advisors who encourage him to take the faithful census. Taking the Satan in this verse is a terrestrial opponent, nonetheless, does not seem the most plausible reading of the passage, that a human adversary rather than God would stir up trouble for Israel creates more questions than answers. And yeah, I think that's true. But if we will see the Satan in First Chronicle 21 as a very likely a divine attacker or executioner, like the one who comes against Balaam in Numbers 22, then that would make more sense. Several similarities between the Chronicles and Numbers make this by far the most plausible interpretation of the Chronicles passage. With regard to parallels between the passage, this passage in Chronicles and other passages that we mentioned earlier, it's not unusual for scholars to note the resemblance between First Chronicles 21 and Zechariah, or even between First Chronicles 21 and Job 1 and 2. So, yeah, we're basically done with chapter 1. As we see, there are different a-Satans and the Satans in all of these Old Testament passages. Again, it was a very technical chapter with a lot of Hebrew and Greek words, and trust me, we skipped a lot, but it was, it's very beneficial when we're talking about something. We want to make sure that what we know, we speak with certainty. What we don't know, that we would say, well, I don't know. In later understanding, especially the New Testament, we see who the Satan is, but before that, that understanding was not very well developed, which reminds me of the topic of death, Sheol, and the underworld. It was not developed when it comes to especially the afterlife. That came in later, some of the later books of the Old Testament. It wasn't necessarily at the very beginning. So it just shows us that as God was revealing truth to people, that their understanding of reality and their the cosmos and the universe, especially in the spiritual sense, would be more developed over time, just in the same fashion that in the New Testament we see the progression of knowledge and theology compared to the Old Testament. But also I would agree with Ben that sometimes we simply do not know if the Satan who will be executing serving as a divine executioner, if he is not the one who would rebel and became as the Satan that we know as Lucifer and the devil. So yeah, I think I would agree with that. That even though the number of scholars, including Dr. Stokes, would say that we have to be careful. Not every a Satan or the Satan are the Satan, the Lucifer, the devil, but yeah, we don't know if one of them was the one who actually rebelled later, but before that was simply serving God. Is there? It's a lengthy. It's a lengthy chapter that we'll have to skip when it comes to the rest of the material. Dr. Stokes speaks about subchapters such as early notions of God's executioners. He goes here through a number of passages, and then he summarizes the chapter using these words. He says, while the Chronicles Satan is distinct from God, similar to Zacharias, this Satan is likely to be identified with the angel of Yahweh, similar to the Satan of Numbers. Finally, while both Chronicles and Zechariah appear to make use of Satan figures in an effort to deal with God's transcendence, there is little evidence that the Chronicle was uncomfortable, in particular with God's involvement in David's sin and Israel's suffering. The texts discussed in this chapter bear witness to theological development, but not a simple one. Rather, they attest to the simultaneous existence of differing notions of Satan's. And I think this is a very good is the very good ending paragraph when it comes to the first chapter, because even though we've seen a lot of examples of a Satans and the Satans, and many times they'll be merely human figures, we have to be careful when making final decision and saying, oh yeah, look at this passage, I'll prove you that that Satan, Lucifer, the devil, was in this text doing something evil, while it could be an angel doing God's will, or simply a human Satan, just like Peter was Satan to Jesus in one instance. Any final thoughts on chapter 1?
Yeah, a few things. Maybe you'll disagree with this clarification. I think you would agree. I think you'd agree that when we speak of I haven't read where the book addresses this yet, but when we speak about Peter acting as a Satan, it might be possible that within the scope of like Second Temple Judaism, where the idea of the Satan is more developed, Jesus might have been referring to Peter acting like the figure we know as the Satan, or it could be referring to him just being a Satan. It could go either way, that's another thing too, right? That was, hopefully that's something helpful to bring up. But another thing I wanted to talk about too a little bit is theological development. We see theological development within the Bible's formation, like we talked about the difference between Samuel and First Chronicles. I don't think that's an issue at all for inerrancy, if that concerns anybody, because I think that I think as the Hebrew Bible develops and thinks about things, the human authors, through God's divine inspiration, are thinking about what has previously been written in new and helpful ways that provide context from a different angle. Would you say that's maybe a helpful way to look at it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I wanted to say that. And then we have the issue of theological development within Judaism leading into the New Testament. And that's something that is more of a challenge. But I think it's true that God's word as we sit with the text, we learn more about it. And the same is true with the Christian tradition, where we're having to, at the same time, we're having to reform and go back to the past and see, how did people in Second Temple Judaism and people in the early church think about this? And we're making new discoveries that may not have been known in the past at the same time. It's a constant effort of going forward and reforming at the same time is kind of the nature of biblical understanding. Those were just my thoughts about doctrinal development within the Bible and beyond it. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, just a second. Yeah, so when it comes to the second chapter, we don't have to spend too much time speaking about Job. Let me just switch immediately to the second subchapter, which Dr. Stokes called the Satan as attacker or executioner. So Satan here is called one of the heavenly beings or sons of God, Banei Ha Elohim in Hebrew. And he's here serving God, and he's the one with whom the Satan comes before God on both occasions in this story, as we know this in Job 1:6 and 2:1. And although some scholars have suggested that the Satan is not a member of this group, but is an intruder, this is not the most straightforward reading of the passage, according to Dr. Stokes. If the Satan is not one of these beings, then the setting of the conversation between God and the Satan on a day when all of the sons of God have gathered to present themselves before Yahweh is just unnecessary, although later literature will portray the Satan more as a rebel among heavenly beings than as one who is among God's functionaries. This sort of parting of the ways between God and the Satan does not seem to have taken place as yet. So again, we see the progression of understanding revelation in theology when it comes to this divine figure of Satan. So among the same lines that this individual is referred to throughout the narrative as Hasatan or the Satan, indicates that this designation here, just as in Zechariah 3, refers to a particular officer in the heavenly court. So he'll be the executioner or the attacker in God's service. The notion of the Satan as God's executioner accounts for much of what this figure says and does in the book of Job. When Yahweh inquires into whence the Satan has come, the Satan replies that he has been going to and fro on the earth. And we all know this passage. And he'd been walking left and right, up and down, just looking and observing. So when God asked him if he has taken, if he was observing Job and how he was so holy and living faithful to God, we know how that dialogue exchange ended, that Satan was basically telling God to put Job to test in a way that he'll be attacked. And we know that God told Saul not to touch his life, that he's able to inflict certain things on Job, but not to kill him. So in the light of the fact that Satan's plurality elsewhere in the Hebrew scripture typically act as physical assailants, one is probably to understand the business of Job's Satan similarly. When this Satan comes across as evildoer, he was authorized to dispense corporal or capital punishment on behalf of God. So this Satan basically got permission from God, and then he proceeded to strike Job, and we know what happened. So this is a complicated passage because the role of Satan in this book involves more than mere surveillance. More important for the story of Job is that the Satan is supposed to do what is he supposed to do when he encounters a wicked person? As in the case with the superhuman Satans mentioned in the previous chapter, the Satan in this book of Job is God's agent of punishment. When the Satan asks God to stretch out God's hand and strike Job, God simply says, he's in your power. I'm sorry for that. So God allows Satan to bring disaster on a person, even though Job is righteous and faithful. He's not perfect, but he's righteous. And since Job has done nothing wrong, this agent, the Satan, must obtain special permission from God to attack him, which means that if Job was living a wicked life, maybe by default, this executioner called the Satan in this passage would already have by default God's permission to attack such an evildoer. But because Job was living such a faithful life to God and devoted, he didn't have God's permission to attack him. Do you find this very beginning of the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2, interesting how, with the whole permission to attack Job, and that basically, at least according to some scholars like Dr. Stokes, the Satan is God's executioner. We don't know if he's the Satan that we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, I do find that really interesting. I mean, the opening chapters of Job, I mean, the whole point of Job is it's a theodicy, right? It's asking the question, why bad things happen to righteous people. And I think it's a necessary thing for us to wrestle with, and I think it was necessary for Israel to kind of make sense of stuff. And I do think that there's a question posed, and like, how much of this is the person of Satan, whoever he is in this passage, and how much of it is directly from God. I almost wonder if the text itself is trying to raise that question. How much of that is of God's will, and how much of that is God just allowing something to happen? And I think my understanding of Job is that Job has been this book throughout the history of Judaism that is an attempt that has been used to make sense of the tribulations that the people of Israel have faced, whether it be, exile, whether it be, just hardship, or all kinds of stuff. You know what I mean? Sorry, I was blanking a little bit, but it's a really difficult question that I don't know the answer to, frankly.
Yeah, it makes sense, because sometimes I like asking difficult questions to my guests and friends, which are not fair, and I know that. But, sometimes we do that on the podcast. We throw our guests under the bus. I'm just kidding. So, yeah, the following subchapter would be, is the Satan an accuser in Job? And this is a very good question that Dr. Stokes is asking. He says, there is little in the prologue of Job to suggest that the Satan was believed to be an accuser of sinners or a heavenly prosecuting attorney, as many scholars have supposed. And what is interesting about the whole book, Dr. Stokes has no problem with disagreeing with a number of scholars when they're either translating certain Hebrew words, including Satan and Hasatan, or those who will be in Bible commentaries explaining the passages where this figure of Satan or Hasatan, the Satan, would be portrayed, because he will say, hey, you're not paying attention to the context. Here is a human being, here's a divine angelic being, not necessarily the Satan. And here, okay, with this passage, maybe you can go that way. But so he has no problem disagreeing with other scholars, of course, in a gentle and respectful way. So yeah, he's saying that there's little evidence that that Satan was believed to be accuser of sinners or a heavenly prosecuting attorney, as many scholars have supposed. So this title, Satan or Satan, indicates not that this figure is an accuser, but that he's an attacker or executioner. The story of Job also presupposes that physical attack is fundamentally the nature of the Satan's work. And this is where I'm going back to what Ben said about 10 minutes ago. We don't know if this, even if in some of these passages, was really that Luciferian, the devil, the Satan creature, who is God's archenemy. We don't know if one of them was actually him who later rebelled, but was actually before that serving God in executing, his will, and even executing when it comes to people. So we don't know, because that story is not fully given. We can only try to connect the dots with what we have, both in the Bible and extra biblical sources. So the Satan is not the accuser of a sinner, Dr. Stokes concludes. Job has committed no crime in this story, and that's a good argument. The Satan in this whole story calls the integrity of the blameless Job into question. Now, what when it comes to the contributions of Job to the Satan tradition? Well, the sorts of disaster for which the heavenly Satan figure was held responsible seems to have been expanded. In earlier passages, heavenly Satans, like the destroyer of the Exodus narrative, bring only death to those who have offended God. So, yeah, you can be an executioner, but that doesn't mean necessarily you're an evil person. You're just doing what God told you to be. You're being faithful. So the idea that the Satan might incite God against the righteous in this way likely played a significant role in the rise of the belief that the Satan is the accuser of the brethren, which we read in Revelation 12:10. So yeah, this was a short chapter when it comes to Job, and I'm glad for the sake of time and my throat, any concluding thoughts on the Satan in the book of Job?
Not off the top of my head, not right now.
Okie dokie. So yeah, chapter 3 is for all the fans of the Divine Council worldview, a phenomenal chapter because Dr. Stokes goes into so many Divine Council connections, explanation of the roles of demons, evil spirits, fallen angels, angelic beings, all of these entities and beings, and explains them through the lens of what you will easily understand if you like Dr. Heiser and similar scholars who wrote on Divine Council. So Dr. Stokes goes and says that satanic executioners are not the only superhuman forces that threaten humankind in the world as depicted in the Hebrew scriptures. The literature of Israel also speaks of demonic foreign deities worshipped by Israel, harmful spirits that afflict and mislead humans, as well as certain divine beings called sons of God, who appear in several biblical passages and are associated with various activities. So now we're switching to taxonomies and terminology for harmful superhuman beings. So Dr. Stokes is going to explain what will be the semantic range of demon and evil spirit, and these labels synonymy, and not the innovations of modern English speakers would be. So he says that with regard to the synonymy of demon and evil spirit, some of the New Testament books employ Greek words daimonion and pneuma interchangeably with reference to the very same beings. For example, Luke 9. The wide semantic range of demon has ancient roots dating as far as back as the Jewish translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, called the Septuagint. So the translators of Septuagint used daimonion to translate a variety of Hebrew words. For example, the Greek version of Isaiah 13:21 translates Sairim, which appears in a list of beings that inhabit desolate areas, as daimonia. So also Hebrew Shedim and Elim, generic designations for foreign deities, are translated with daimonia. We read this in Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 96, 106, and so on, by translating these different Hebrew terms with a single Hebrew term. Whether wittingly or unwittingly, these translators united that were distinct categories in Hebrew into a single overarching Greek category, daimonia. And this is not helping us the case, because, for example, when if people loved reading or watching the fantasy series His Dark Material, you see that people, including children, both in books and TV show, are followed by these little furry creatures, animals called daimonians. And if your mind as a Christian goes directly to the Bible and you're like, oh, these are demons, they're not necessarily demons. They're not necessarily evil. They're just portrayed as a spiritual, I don't even know if we can call them divine beings, but let's say spiritual divine beings who are embodied as animals. So that helps us see that demon, or in Greek daimonion, was not necessarily something evil. And that is the fault of the translators in Septuagint when they were translating Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek, that they were put all these different types of demonic entities like Shedim, Elohim, Seirim, and other entities. They will all translate them as a daimonion. But that doesn't help the case. It doesn't resolve the problem for us when we're thinking about deities, when we're talking about, in this case, foreign deities or divine sons of God, or if we're talking about demons. We cannot categorize all of these Hebrew terminology and Hebrew classes into one Greek word and one Greek terminology. They're all daimonion, even if they are. But that doesn't help me understand if they're good or bad. Like, are they on God's side or they're on the, opposing God? That doesn't help us. So this is why it's always good to go back to Hebrew, even though Septuagint is a great translation and even was used by in the times of Jesus and the apostles, but it doesn't help us, at least with this translation. So we should not presume that all ancient Israelite and Jewish authors share this conception of the superhuman realm. As Dr. Stokes explains, It will not suffice simply to speak of demons in the Hebrew scriptures or in the Book of the Watchers, because we need more categories. It will also be incorrect, despite the popular usage of the designations, to assume that demons are the same as evil spirits in all the ancient texts, because let me tell you, evil spirits are evil spirits. They're evil. They're bad, period. But demons as daimonion, they're not all bad. They're simply spiritual divine beings. That would be like saying that Elohim, besides Yahweh Elohim, that all other Elohim are evil, but they're not. They're fallen Elohim beings. They're good, faithful Elohim beings. So it's not all black and white. Okay, Ben, when it comes to demons, evil spirits, and the sons of God in the Hebrew scriptures, can you tell something about them? Here, Dr. Stokes speaks about Shadim. He speaks about this certain type of daimonia or demons. He goes to Deuteronomy 32. Can you please help us summarize this section?
Yeah, so it seems that, as we were just talking about, there are three distinct traditions from the Hebrew Bible that are especially important to early Jewish discussions of evil, its divine agents, and the Satan. So one of them is the Sadim, or demons, as the word is traditionally translated. Among the words in the Hebrew Bible that ancient and modern translators have rendered as demoniae in the Greek, or demons, the notion of the Sadim has exerted the greatest influence on the developing demonologies of early Judaism. Although Sadim are mentioned only twice in the Hebrew Bible, like Deuteronomy 32 or Psalm 106, they would figure prominently in early Jewish discussions of evil and its superhuman proponents. The second tradition is one that is distinct from that of the Sadim and pertains to certain maleficent spirits that would bring various manners of harm on humans. These evil spirits traditions would also play a significant role in early Jewish discussions of the Satan, sin, and suffering. A third tradition is that of the sons of God, and these divine beings, not to be confused either with demons or with evil spirits, appear in a handful of biblical passages. Probably most notably in Genesis 6, 1-4. The text reports what we talked about earlier, where there are sons of God who take human women and have children, and those are the Nephilim, whatever that is, right? I think something helpful to say maybe is that you can kind of think about the language here. There's a distinction between the language, how we, or maybe the tradition would use it, and how early Judaism uses it, and even how the Old Testament uses it. You know what I mean? Things develop over time, and that's not even necessarily bad. We just have to make distinction because you're speaking within somewhat different systems. You know what I mean? And so for us, the word demon just kind of means bad spirit. And that's fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily. We just have to understand that it's more of a general term in the Bible, you know. Same with angel. With angel, I believe it's kind of the other way around, where angel we've turned into a general term that in the Bible was something kind of specific, you know, where the term angel was specifically like a messenger, right? And then the demon is just kind of a spiritual being of a foreign nation, right? And of course, all the things intermingle with each other, and I think you could say that one is also the other oftentimes. But I think it's just important to note that we're dealing with kind of different playing fields, and that doesn't make one bad. I think the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition and the way the Hebrew Bible, sometimes they develop in different ways. I don't think they should contradict each other, but just sometimes language gets confused, and sometimes they just think about language in different ways. I'm not trying to say that, just to be clear, I'm not trying to say that it's good that there are differences. I'm trying to say it's kind of morally neutral as far as language goes, right? Do you get what I'm saying? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. I don't know if you mentioned the third tradition. You were mentioning the first tradition was Shadim. The second tradition of these evil spirits would be distinct from that of Shadim. and it would pertain to certain maleficent spirits, right? Evil spirits. But the third tradition would be speaking of the sons of God. So these would be the
in
divine
Genesis
beings.
6, right?
Yeah, and but they would not to be confused with demons or even with evil spirits who are appearing in a number of passages. So yeah, if we go very briefly, Shadim, demons are mentioned just twice in the Bible. One is Deuteronomy 32 and once in Psalm 106. Etymologically, the word has been related to the Akkadian Shedum, which could refer to either a protective or a malevolent spirit. In both of its biblical occurrences, Shedim designates gods or putative gods other than the God of Israel. When it comes to evil spirits, this is interesting also because Near East depicts a world teeming with invisible forces that are out to harm humanity. Beings who would arbitrarily attack the righteous people and the wicked people alike. These beings would cause various sorts of illnesses, and special procedures were prescribed to relieve a person of their afflictions. Okay, so we're seeing there these different demonic entities are out there, and they have different roles, right? And this is why this topic is heavily divine counsel. And here we have examples that Dr. Stokes gave, such as in 1 Samuel 16 and Saul. We won't go through all of that because that will take us days. We see another type of hormonal spirit being mentioned in 1 Kings 22, and so on and so on. And then we're coming to the third types of these beings, and these are the sons of God. So the term sons of God, B'nai Ha Elohim, are related expressions that are occurring in several passages in the Hebrew scriptures. And we know the famous one, the number one would be Deuteronomy 32:8. Then we also know the second famous one would be Psalm 82. And here they're called B'nai Elyon, sons of the Most High. We also have Psalm 89:7. These are all famous passages to whoever is familiar with Dr. Heiser's work and the work in general of Divine Counsel. So these three traditions of demons, evil spirits, and these antediluvian sons of God would be brought together in a synthetic explanation of sin and suffering. So what about all these demons and evil spirits and the sons of heaven in the Book of the Watchers? So here we're dealing with apocrypha, so likely composed sometime in the 3rd century BC. The Book of the Watchers, which is first 36 chapters of First Enoch. It contained what is perhaps the earliest known interpretation of the sons of God story in Genesis 6. Some scholars have suggested that First Enoch chapter 6 to 11 even predates the Genesis version story, and that one reads in the first 4 verses of Genesis 6 is based on the portion of the Book of the Watchers. I found that very interesting. That even though it was written later, but oral tradition and the context could even predate the time where Moses was penning down Genesis 6. Yeah, this is an early account where the sons of God came down to mate with women. We know this from Genesis 6. And these angelic beings, while they're not named as the Watchers in Genesis 6, they are in First Enoch in the Book of the Watchers. So they take human wives, they beget these monstrous children with them. We know this story about the hybrid offspring that comes out from them. What else came out from these Watchers? Well, we got forbidden knowledge. So it is widely held by scholars that First Enoch chapter 6 to 11, which tells the story of the Watchers, is a distinct compositional unit. Within this unit of text, scholars have further distinguished 2 strands of material. One of these tells how 200 Watchers, led by a Watcher named Shemihaza, descended to Earth, marry human women, and have children by them. As a result of their hybrid nature, the Watchers' children have superhuman appetites that drive them to kill and devour humans. And we also know this, whoever read First Enoch. When it comes to the origin and activity of evil spirits? Well, the Book of the Watchers contains 2 passages that addresses the activity of these evil spirits. The first one in First Enoch 15 and 16 elaborates on these inappropriate actions of the Watchers' relationship with human women. These chapters teach that the sexual intermingling of immortal spiritual beings with mortal flesh violated the order of creation. The product of these forbidden unions, as a result of the hybrid origin, would have both a fleshly and spiritual composition. Because what happened? Well, the creature's immortal spiritual halves have survived after the flood in the form of evil spirits that will continue to afflict humans until the final judgment. And here, where very important passage for people who like taking notes would be 1 Enoch 15, how the demons came to be when the giants, when the Nephilim died, the spirits that will leave their bodies. Well, these are basically demons. So even though this is not in the Bible, it's found in Jewish apocrypha, and it was known throughout the Jewish tradition. Okay, switching to demons, evil spirits, fallen angels, and the worship of false gods. Ben, when it comes to 1 Enoch chapters 17 and 19, it says that this passage offers a brief account of Enoch's tour to the mythical world. So can you please help us explaining what happens in chapter 19 when he comes to the edge of the earth?
Yeah, well, so in chapter 19, he arrives at the edge of the earth, where he observes pillars of fire standing in a great chasm. So Uriel, one of Enoch's angelic tour guide in this journey, he comments that there stand the angels who mingled with the women, and their spirits, having assumed many forms, bring destruction on men and lead them astray to sacrifice to demons as to gods until the day of the great judgment, in which they will be judged with finality. That's what it says in verse 1. And here, as in the previous etiology, harmful spirits are associated with the watchers who sinned prior to the flood. In this passage, however, the evil spirits are referred to as their spirits. That is, the spirits of the sinful angels. The passage does not say that the spirits are the disembodied spirits of the watchers' half-breed children or something like that. Instead, some scholars have suggested that the spirits here are supposed to be the spirits of the watchers themselves. Since the understanding of the passage requires the transgressing angels to be simultaneously imprisoned and causing trouble on earth, it's unlikely that the spirits are the same persons as the angels. The spirits in this passage are likely, as in chapter 15, thought to be the watcher's offspring. The text emphasizes the present relationship of the spirits to the sinful angels. And that really resonates with what I was talking about earlier with my own writing, right? There's this sense of passing through of creation categories. There's the sense of breaching of space in inappropriate fashions is really what what evil spiritual entities attempt to do, right? And in this case, it's spiritual entities intermingling with human women to do whatever they want to do. You know what I mean? To have offspring.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, so I think it should be emphasized that the spirits of the angels do not appear to be identical with demons in 1 Enoch 19. Based on the text considered so far, we should expect that these two categories of superhuman beings would be distinguished. As we said before, the notions of evil spirits and demons, Shadim, are distinct in the Hebrew scriptures, which is not always seen in Septuagint version of the Hebrew Old Testament, unfortunately. So in later literature, demons and evil spirits come to be more or less synonymous, and that is not fair to the original biblical text, but it is what it is. So this may be the earliest passage in which the concept of evil spirits and demons are associated with each other, an association that would later lead to their equation, even though they were not the same at the very beginning. So in this passage, spirits harm humans and lead them to worship false gods. Demons, on the other hand, are the false gods themselves. So demonic, divine, or semi-divine beings that are fallen angels or fallen sons of God. So they'll be called demons, but the harmful evil spirits would be actually leading people or inciting them or deceiving them to worship this fallen angelic being, son of God, that will be quote unquote called maybe demons. So sometimes nuances are smaller, sometimes they're bigger, and headache can be caused again based on translations. And that, just as Dr. Stokes said few times throughout the book, that also other scholars are not always helpful when they don't explain these things to the audience, or if you're preaching, or if you're writing a book, or if you're leading a seminary class, if you're not explaining these nuances and differences, then it's also our part of the problem when we don't emphasize these differences to our audience, because not every devil is the devil, not every demon is the demon, not every Elohim is the Elohim that you think in your head is the Elohim, just like Yahweh Elohim. There are many distinct there are many differences between all these categories, just like if there are different categories when it comes to the beginning of the episode where we were talking about other things, including a Satan and the Satan. So there are differences and there are classes. Possibly related to this work of deception is the statement that these spirits have assumed many forms. It is not exactly clear what kind of multiformity the author of this passage has in mind, because Aramaic magic balls and amulets from the first millennium of this era speak of spirits appearing to persons in dreams or visions in the form of animals or of other frightening creatures. I found it very interesting, especially with people having nightmares, sleeping paralysis, or feel like the devil is attacking them in their dreams, or demons, or these shadowy persons. We speak about these things so many often on the podcast. So here's a fine example of supernatural fringe things being connected with biblical and historical theology. So in the present context, the polymorphic nature of the spirits probably has to do with the work of destruction or deception. Dr. Nickelberg cites as Nickelsberg cites as potential parallels the transformation of the Watchers into human form in one of the passages, and also more important, the appearance of the devil to Eve as an angel in apocrypha of, I think it's called Apocrypha of Moses, chapter 17. So I'm going to skip a lot of this because of the sake of time. And I'm going to ask you if you have any additional thoughts when it comes to this Divine Council, chapter 3, when it comes to all these Shadim demons, when it comes to these evil spirits, and when it comes, to their role of inciting people, deceiving them, and even attacking them.
Evil divine beings may transform into an animal or something like that. Is that not what we see in Genesis? A evil divine being impersonating a creature. There's that same emphasis on liminality that I was speaking about earlier. That's really what I saw that stuck out to me in this section.
Okay, thanks for that. And now we're switching to last two chapters for tonight, and we'll try to go briefly, especially with chapter 5. Both chapters are very connected because they're talking about this prince called Mastema. I hope that's the proper pronunciation, because I don't know how to properly pronounce it. I didn't hear about this name before. But here we have to deal with the Book of Jubilees, which is an apocrypha, not part of any of the three main Christian branches of Christianity Bibles, yet it was considered as an important book in the Jewish tradition. So here, the entity that we call the Satan, even though I'll underline again that we don't know his name actually, because Lucifer is found in King James, which basically means light bearer. The Satan could have become his name based on his role and his character traits, even though we don't know if that's really his name. The devil is certainly not his name. So we're talking about this entity that is basically, I wouldn't say nameless, but we don't know his name for sure. Yet in the Book of Jubilees, he's identified to be the Prince of Mastema, or simply Mastema. So the last two chapters for tonight have to deal with that. However, they differ because, and here I see one of the flaws of the Book of Jubilees, because in the first part of the Book of Jubilees, Satan is described as God's agent, and he's called Prince Mastema. He's not portrayed as bad one, evil one, not even God's archenemy. But in the second section of the Book of Jubilees, which is in the following chapter, chapter 5, then Mastema, this satanic figure, is suddenly evil. So this is all happening in the same Book of Jubilees. So let's try to interpret this book, often referred to as rewriting or retelling of the Hebrew scriptures. This book recounts many of the stories told in Genesis and in the first 19 chapters of Exodus. Jubilees also uses Book of Enoch, the Book of Watchers, and some other sources for their inspiration and writing. The prevailing scholarly opinion until recently was that the Jubilees was largely the work of a single author writing sometime in the 2nd century BC, and that the ideas expressed in the work represent the opinions of Jubilees' author. But Dr. Michael Segal has challenged this assumption, arguing that the person who produced the Book of Jubilees was not really an author in the sense that most people today think of authorship, but really the person was more probably considered to be a redactor or composer who incorporated various written sources into one book, supplying commentary along the way. So that's interesting to see because, like in everything else, scholars agree and disagree. Okay. So like I said, with regard to Satan, Jubilees portray this Mastema character in two different ways. So let's start first with the first way that he's represented. So let's talk about taxonomy, terminology, and titles for harmful superhuman beings. Do you want to start with this section, Ben?
Yeah, sure. So in Jubilee, you encounter various kinds of these sort of satanic beings. Some are human and some are superhuman, which is different from Job and Zechariah. However, the primary superhuman Satan figure in Jubilees goes by the title the Prince of Mastema, which is where we're getting this whole Mastema thing from, rather than the Satan. And though Jubilees likely makes use of this latter designation in one instance, so the Prince of Mastema may be correlated to the Satan in one instance, but in general, there's this head Satan figure called the Prince of Mastema. We know that Jubilees was composed in Hebrew, and from which it was translated into Greek, and from Greek it was then translated into Latin and Ethiopic. And bits of the Greek remain, and a portion of the Latin has survived, and the work is available in its entirety only in Ethiopic. And so this means that for the large majority of the book, one has access only to a translation of the original. So this book, there's some really heavy interpretive challenges in this book to try to get to what these Second Temple Jews thought about the world and how they thought about the biblical cosmos and how they interpreted the Bible, you know.
Yes, when it comes to satanic titles and terminology, the usual title for the Satan in Jubilees is the Prince of Mastema. And we see this in a number of passages, or just Prince Mastema without the. In one passage, the Ethiopic version speaks of Mastema, the leader of the spirits. So the Prince of Mastema is to be identified with a Satan. In the Book of Jubilees is clear when one parallels this with Jubilees later chapters, such as chapter 10, verse 11, when the designation Satan or the Satan refers to this figure. And now Dr. Stokes gives a number of examples. So, for example, the binding of Isaac, which we read in the Pentateuch, in Jubilee 17 reworks the story of Abraham's trial into a tale that very much resembles that of Job. How so? Well, because it portrays God's seemingly unreasonable demand that Abraham sacrifices his son would be a test of Abraham's character instigated in heaven by the Prince of Mastema. So in the Jubilees version, here is not God testing, here is Prince of Mastema, or the Satan, coming to God just as he did in Job chapter 1 and 2, And just as he did with Job in this passages telling God to test Job, he supposedly here told God to test Abraham. So this is why this book, among other things, is not in the canon, because it takes from so many sources, and it's not just a work of one person, and it's basically retelling so many passages wherever, especially wherever God would seem to be the main person leading, or not necessarily leading, but being in charge of something. Here is like, well, actually, it's the Satan or the Prince of Mastema coming and actually doing this. So it's almost as if the author of the Jubilees or the authors were trying to, wherever passage may be a fringe top passage that will make the readers think, oh, was God involved into sin, or was God involved into something evil? So that the authors here would be saying, well, it was the devil who was doing this. And this is what Dr. Stokes says throughout the whole book, that not just when it comes to Jubilees, but in some other, I think, examples where we're drawing information outside the biblical passages, including, well, primarily apocrypha. If we see any rework or retelling of a story where it's actually the Satan, in charge of something, or his fault of evil and sin, or human calamity or disaster, they're always trying to rewrite so that it wouldn't be God behind that. So yeah, the idea of divine hostility is probably at the root of the title in Jubilees, according to which the Prince of Mastema is tasked by God with punishing wicked humans. With regard to the noun Satan, Jubilees reflects the diverse usage that one observes in the Hebrew scriptures, which use Satan as a common noun that means attacker. In one instance, it refers to the Satan, the Prince of Mastema, in Jubilees 10:11. In other 4 occurrences, chapters 23, 40, 46, and 50, the designation appears to denote a generic attacker rather than a particular individual. Some of these attackers appear to be of the human variety, whereas others are more likely superhuman. All 4 passages that use Satan or Satan generically borrow from the language of 1 Kings 5, which describes the peaceful conditions of the early period of Solomon's reign. In 3 of these texts in Jubilees, the notion of a human military attackers make very good sense. So again, just like as we did with the first chapter of the book at the beginning of our podcast, not every a Satan or the Satan would be you're the devil, the Satan, God's arch enemy. It could be simply humans or even angelic beings opposing other people. So yeah, Jubilees 23 employs the language of 1 Kings 5 to describe the eschatological period as well, but does so likely with reference to a superhuman rather than human Satan. And then Dr. Stokes says there is possibility that in this passage, it could be a human Satan. I'm going to skip a lot because it gets very technical. And on page 127, he started talking about Belial. So because my throat is giving up on me, do you mind if you please continue with this passage?
What you kind of find is, so another description that some scholars have claimed the Jubilees uses for the Satan is Belial. So, sorry about getting caught for a second there. So Belial is a name for the Satan figure that occurs with frequency in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as is the case with Mastema and Satan, the word is not the same. It is not the name of a superhuman being in the Hebrew Scriptures. It is a common noun. So just as we might call someone a Satan, we might also call someone a Belial. And this common noun is somewhat ambiguous, but it's used to describe wicked or worthless persons, often as part of the expression son or daughter, man of Belial, which actually has some interesting parallels, maybe to the New Testament or to something like the Didache, perhaps. That's just a thought. But anyway, so in poetry, Belial appears in parallelism with things like death and Sheol. And so you actually find in Jubilee 1533, the angel of the presence tells Moses that some Israelites will disobediently leave their children uncircumcised, and these disobedient descendants of Jacob are referred to as the sons of Belial. And although most translators take Belial in the statement as a name, as the Greek and Ethiopic translators seem to have understood, in the Hebrew it may simply have been a common noun, as in the identical expression that we find in earlier literature. Wicked people might be a good translation for this word. These scholars, or like a good translation of something like sons of Belial would be wicked people. I'm sorry, is what I mean. And the scholars who understand Belial in 1533 as a name probably do this based on the assumption that this name also occurs in 120, where it says, "May your mercy, Lord, be lifted over your people. Create for them a just spirit. May the spirit of Belial not rule them so as to bring changes or charges against them before you, and to trap them away from every proper path so that they may be destroyed from your presence. Create for them a pure mind and a Holy Spirit." Very much Psalm 51 vibes. Although Belial is a common name for the Satan figure in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's not obvious that the word is used this way in Jubilees. It gets kind of technical here, but basically, the word used probably could be translated simply as wicked spirit.
Yeah, and when we speak about the designations for these demons and evil spirits, Jubilees employs really a wide range of words usage to refer to harmful spirits. In addition to these words, such as you just read, spirits of Belial or Satan, we also find some other words such as spirits, evil spirits, severed spirits, spirits of Mastema, forces of Mastema, or even Lord's forces. So it's also interesting that on top of that, we also find demons and impure demons throughout the whole book of the Jubilees. And these are, well, at least in this section, when it comes to Mastema, it's very interesting how, one can compare the words, one can compare passages, and one can compare their association or dissociation with Prince of Mastema. So the book of Jubilees also refers to these beings who afflict and mislead humans as spirits, and employs the term demons for those beings who are also the objects of the nations and occasionally even Israel's misguided worship. So if you want to blame someone who is deceiving people, it's not always the Satan, but there are also these fallen principalities, powers that are even called forces of Mastema in Jubilees 49 verse 2, which reminded me of Paul's usage of the fallen sons of God when he was talking about principalities and powers. Powers or forces are basically synonyms. So yeah, these are all connected, and they're all supposedly connected to Prince Mastema, and in some even passages they're explained to be under his guidance, but not in every passage. So yeah, the Prince of Mastema is the chief prince of these spirits, and he's misleading and afflicting the nations, where that's easily or not easily, but where is that explained in a clear passage, one gets that understanding. So he's in charge of them, and he's not mentioned at all, which is interesting, in Jubilees in the first 9 chapters. So that's very interesting. So with Jubilees 10, he's getting kind of important there. So while the Prince of Mastema outranks evil spirits in the divine structure, from a literary standpoint, this prince, it's so hard for me to call him prince, plays more of a supporting role to the evil spirits. So sometimes he's called or put in this category of being above them. Sometimes he's there to support them. So again, we see this evolution of Prince of Mastema, who is thought to be the Satan, and his roles and his actions. So I think we can skip this subchapter, the danger of deceptive spirits, because yeah, they're deceptive. But what about when it comes to Prince of Mastema, who is in charge of them? Well, starting with chapter 10, again, we get to know this entity, this fallen principality. And we are given different passages. For example, here we know the story of Noah. So Noah, in the version of Jubilee, he learns that the evil spirits are misleading, blinding, and killing his grandchildren. And there's a whole passage of what happens, in that account in Jubilees 10 verses 3-6. But if the evil spirits are able to continue their work of deception and death unchecked, then Noah predicts they will completely destroy his descendants from the earth. Therefore, Noah asked God to have the spirits incarcerated and to save his descendants and humanity once again from total annihilation. In response to Noah's request to have the spirits bound, God orders the angels of the presence to imprison all the evil spirits. Mastema, however, objects to their incarceration. So the spirits, this is interesting. So the spirits who are about to be imprisoned, Mastema argues, are necessary for his work of punishing human wickedness. So Mastema here is not seen as God's archenemy. He's like basically saying, like, hey, I'm just trying to do my work and punish people. How can I punish people if all these spirits who are under my guidance, my soldiers, if they're imprisoned? So God must now leave a sufficient number of spirits in Mastema's service so that they may inflict harm that is, that is related to the sin of the humankind. In the end, so that humankind will not be altogether destroyed, God has 90% of the spirits bound. And again, this is according to the Book of Jubilees. So God leaves 10% of the spirits in the service of Mastema for the purpose of punishing human wickedness. So it's almost like Mastema here is negotiating with God. It's a very interesting passage. So his request for God to leave some spirits free to serve him presumes, so as do Job 1 and 2 and Zechariah 3, that Satan has been tasked by God with punishing wicked humans. Again, a lot of interesting texts which we don't have time to dissect. I know the book is pricey, but it's worthy. It's worth to be invested and learn when it comes to history and evolution of theology of Satan. So although the Prince of Mastema is identified as the leader of the evil spirits, there's a question as to whether he himself is one of them. Does the Prince of Mastema, according to Jubilees, belong to those spiritual beings created by God on the first day of creation, Jubilees 2, verse 2, or is he among the illegitimate offspring of the Watchers? So then Dr. Stokes addresses both possibilities. And yeah, we know that in Jubilees 15, there's a passage that further provides information regarding the difference between God's relationship with Israel and the deity's relationship with other nations. And this parallels Deuteronomy 32. So I'm going to skip a lot of that text. And yeah, this is an interesting subchapter just before the chapter ends. So I'll ask you to read it on page 140, the Satan and the Deception of the Nations. And when you're done with it, you can just also give your opinion when it comes to the whole chapter. What do you think about Mastema here just serving supposedly under God's guidance and being in God's army?
Yeah. Well, so it says that the Prince of Mastema fits into this theological scheme as the chief of the evil spirits who deceive the nations. And although the Prince of Mastema outranks the spirits in the superhuman hierarchy, he is less important to the theology of Jubilees than are the spirits themselves. The Jubilees associates the Prince of Mastema with the harmful and deceptive spirits. In this way, however, mark several important developments in the Satan tradition. From this point forward in the history of the tradition, it becomes commonplace for early Jewish texts to speak of the Satan as the leader of evil spiritual forces. Also, as a result of his association with deceptive spirits, the Prince of Mastema, or the Satan himself, becomes a deceiver of humankind, not merely a punisher or attacker, like we may have seen earlier. Additionally, in the theology of Jubilees, his depiction of the whole world, except for the elect, as under the deceptive control of the Satan and his spirits, would find a home in the theology and literature of early Judaism and Christianity. I think that's actually a really good bridge into how we understand the Book of Jubilees. I've not, now to be clear, I'm a layperson. What I know about Jubilees is frankly from this book. I've not really read the Book of Jubilees and delved into it, but the way I think, I'm someone who's been in the realm of thinking about ancient Near Eastern Jewish literature and been kind of introduced to Midrash and things like that. Judaism, and maybe early Christianity too, but especially Judaism, has always done theology by telling stories. And so this is an example of that. And so this is somebody telling a story and placing themselves in the text and thinking through the text rather than just talking about the text. It's speaking within the text almost. That's how, by my estimation, how Jewish theology, at least in this period, seemed to work. When you think about Midrash and things like that, that's very much what that does. And it gets things correct. You know what I mean? The Book of Enoch is another example. Is the Book of Enoch inspired by God? I would say, probably not. But the Book of Enoch is affirmed as a work of theology that got some things correct. Is it, are these things maybe overly speculative at some points? I mean, sure. You know what I mean? Maybe that's just me being a modernist. I don't know. But I would say, yeah, they're probably pretty overly speculative and probably go too far beyond the text. But the point is that they're trying to think through the text via the process of telling stories and placing themselves in there. And when the New Testament comes along, it actually says, like, hey, you guys were kind of onto something here. Now, obviously the New Testament is using language from this tradition. You know what I mean? We know that the New Testament uses language from the Book of Enoch, for instance. But that's what it's doing, is it's taking theology and it's saying, like, hey, this language and this idea was a good idea and theologically correct. You were onto something here. And it's kind of going from that. Hopefully that's a good explanation of how we can kind of think about this kind of Second Temple literature and not treat it as if it's some crazy thing that, like, holy crap, this needs to be in the Bible. It's not that necessarily. It's just an ancient piece of Jewish theology. And that's what it is. It's a work of theology, and it got some things right and it got some things wrong. And not all of its worldview is shared by the rest of the Bible or the New Testament, That's kind of how I think about it. Would you say that's pretty on track?
Yeah, I mean, that's that's another topic. It would require tons of time of assessing. I mean, just when it comes to Enoch, different people think different way. But I mean, it was held high in Jewish tradition. It was quoted by Peter. It was quoted by Jude, and there's a scholarly book by a lady scholar, Amy something, who wrote a whole scholarly book how the Gospel of Matthew heavily borrows from Enoch and even uses the same terminology. So yeah, apocrypha is not forbidden for us to read. It may not be on the same level as the scriptures, but without it, some of the context when it comes to historical perspective simply would not be understood without it. So yeah, that's what I'll say. So maybe I should have showed this at the beginning of the episode so people would see the chapters we're covering for tonight. So the book has 8 chapters, and we're covering the first 5 for tonight. And the 5th one, the one that we just finished, is about Mastema and his deceptive spirits, but in a form that he's not God's enemy per se, or that he's not a chief enemy, or that he's not evil necessarily. And in the last chapter for tonight, chapter 5, Prince Mastema is turning to be different. He's showing his different side, so to speak. So in the second half of the Book of Jubilees, there's a different understanding and different display of this entity called Prince of Mastema. So in these passages, apart from the agency of evil spirits, Mastema's intentions do not accord with God's plan for Israel, but are contrary to them. He creates problems for humans not as a deceiver and punisher, but simply attacks them in an effort to do them harm. So we see a big evolution in the text, and the big difference in depiction of this entity called Prince of Mastema in the second part of the book of Jubilee. So it is Prince of Mastema rather than God is the one who threatens the well-being of God's people. And there are 3 stories in the book of Jubilees that depict the Prince of Mastema not as a deceiver or punisher, as did the passages discussed in the previous chapter, but as an unprovoked troubler of humankind. I can't pronounce that. 2 of these stories in the Jubilees version of the sacrifice of Isaac and Jubilees retelling of Israel's exodus from Egypt portray the Prince of Mastema as the enemy of Abraham's descendants, in particular, to even in one instance as the protector, and even in one instance as the protector of Israel's enemies. So now it's like, this guy is becoming evil to the core. He is giving his best not just to disobey God, but to unprovokingly, for whatever reasons known to him. It could be jealousy, it could be hatred of everything good and holy and what God loves. So just being a complete opposite from that. So if God is light, well, this is what darkness does. So he's completely unprovoked and outside of God's will, protecting Israel's enemies and in the same time attacking Israel. So there are many instances given in this chapter. We simply don't have time or energy, at least I don't have, to analyze all of them. But for example, in Jubilees 11, Prince Mastema appears as a troubler of humans who is thwarted by a teenage Abram. So we see a young Abram who is still not called Abraham at this point. So according to this story, which is not found in Genesis, in the days of Terah, Abram's father, the Prince of Mastema, is inducing a famine that is, just destroying the humankind. When farmers would sow the seed, the Prince of Mastema would send birds to devour the seed before it could be plowed into the earth, rendering the earth barren. But now, supposedly, Abraham has special gifts that he's using to combat Mastema and to save people. And this is interesting because even other examples in this book are told from a very different scenario and different point of view, as if the author or the authors of the book of Jubilees are just adding so many things, changing so many things, and making look like for everything evil, it's Mastema. It's like, well, God cannot test humans, so it wouldn't be Abraham who would be, tested. It will be Mastema, right? I'm trying to skip a lot of examples given throughout the book because they're not necessarily found in the Pentateuch that Moses wrote, and certainly not in Genesis. So yeah, we're dealing with Abraham, with Isaac, with their descendants, and continually Prince of Mastema has this malicious plot against humankind because he just wants to destroy them. It also happens similarly in the Exodus account. When Moses encounters Yahweh, who is seeking to take Moses' life, and we read this account in Jubilees chapter 4, God stops short of killing Moses, however, and we know this from Genesis. However, when Moses' wife Zipporah circumcises their son and touches the circumcised foreskin to Moses' feet, God stops the attack of Moses. But in Jubilees, such an attack of the life of God's servant Moses was the work not of the deity, so not of God, or one of the angels of the presence, but of the Prince of Mastema. So again, we see the same principle being applied. So just like with Abraham. So it's not God trying to do something or even harming, but whatever, it could be something wrong or evil portrayed to Yahweh. They're introducing Mastema as the one who is doing the evil, as if It's like trying to protect God, but if you read the original story in Genesis, and if you read Bible commentaries of uh, God being angry with Moses and his wife Zipporah trying to circumcise him, it makes sense once when you read it with the commentary. So there's no need to quote unquote protect God from the reader or from the believer. So yeah, in Exodus, if we switch to the Jubilees 48, here's the prince Mastema who is trying to kill Moses in order to prevent him from bringing divine punishment upon the Egyptians. And it is Prince Mastema who is energizing, so to speak, the magicians to fight back Moses. So it's like wherever something evil happens, let's bring Prince Mastema. So he's the number one enemy of God's people portrayed in the second part of the Jubilees. So he, not God, is behind the threats to Israel's well-being. And I mean, sorry, but I'm not sorry. When Israel deserved to be punished, or individuals among Israel's, population, it will never be without no reason. God is not unjust. God is not unfair. God is not unloving. It will be usually a sin of disobedience, idolatry, and something like that. Like, there's no need to protect God, because reading in the context and explained by Bible commentators and theologians, even these difficult and fringe topics and passages from the Old Testament, they do make more sense once when they're dissected than merely seeing something, oh, God is doing this, that is stumbling me, and I'm losing faith in God, especially God's goodness. There's no need for that. There's no need to protect God. So yeah, basically, these two chapters in the book, chapter 4 of Prince Mastema and his deceptive spirits, and this chapter 5, the Prince of Mastema, enemy of God's people, they're sharing or speaking this different stories, different narratives about Mastema. In the chapter 4, he was not evil. He was not, trying to go against God or God's people. But in 5, he is the one who is guilty when it comes to all the sin or all the attacks of God's people. And that's basically chapter 5, where Prince of Mastema is also serving as an accuser. It's basically coming from this, following chapters of Jubilees. For example, Jubilees chapter 48 would be important one when it comes to accusing. We are here dealing with, for example, the angels of the presence are bounding the prince of Mastema for 5 days so that Israel could plunder the Egyptians and depart from Egypt. But according to the Ethiopic translation of this passage, the angel's purpose for binding the prince of Mastema was to prevent him from accusing Israel during these particular days. This statement seems to presuppose the belief that one of the responsibilities of the prince of Mastema among the heavenly host was to serve as an accuser or a prosecuting attorney of sorts in the heavenly courtroom. So we see the later progression of this theology or understanding in the Old and New Testament. So yeah, guys, buy the book. It's not that long. It is technical. You are not supposed to read it as you would read a novel. It's a good book. You can use it as a preacher, as a pastor. You can use it as a layman, just like Ben and I are, because you will learn a lot. And again, not every a Satan or the Satan is the devil, the Satan that we see as the God's arch enemy. We see the evolution and the change when it comes to the theology of the Satan throughout the Bible and apocrypha, extra biblical sources. And guess what? Once again, not every a Satan or the Satan would mean the same. Many times it will be an angelic being unknown to us, but obeying to God. Being obedient to God. Many times it will be a military human person, and sometimes, debatable, it could be the Satan, the God's main arch enemy. So these were the first 5 chapters of the book. We'll see if we'll cover the rest of the 3. I know the book is pricey, but again, buy it. And as well, please subscribe to Ben's Substack. I have provided a link in this video description to both the Amazon link of this book. I'm not making any money if you buy it through that link. That's just a general link. Also support Ben's ministry and his writing as a young theologian. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. This Friday, Sean and I will cover the Gospel of Nicodemus. a very interesting one, even though it's not in the New Testament. It's a very good one, especially when it comes to the theology of harrowing the hell. And then Sunday, Amber is coming back, and we'll be talking about one. I won't give the title of the book yet, but it's a very good, easy to read, writing about Jesus from the Hebrew perspective, about the Rabbi Jesus. It will be a very good one, I promise. Ben, you have the honor to do the concluding part of this podcast. What will be your overall thoughts when it comes to this book, and why would you suggest to people to study this topic? Why is studying the topic of Satan's name, role, origin, and things of that sort? Why is that important for us as the believers and as a global church?
Well, that's a really good question, and thank you for letting me finish off. And thank you so much for directing people to my Substack too, and for the opportunity to be on here. I really appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much. And thank you for I've never really had this opportunity to be on a podcast like this before, and it's a big thing for me, especially as somebody who wants to make content related to the Bible and theology. But yeah, to answer your question, why this book is relevant, why the subject is important for the Church Catholic or the Universal Church, it is, put simply, know your enemy, right? I think that's like number one rule of warfare, right? Is know your enemy. If we don't really understand Satan or what he is, then we're not going to do a very good job of beating him, are we? Now, of course, it's not really on us to beat Satan necessarily. But still, we're like engaged in combat with Satan daily, right? I would hope. So put simply, we have to understand that, and we have to understand that these conversations about chaos, these conversations about Genesis, about Revelation, this is the meta-narrative of the Bible. And so, yes, there's the spiritual combat aspect, and you kind of have to know what you're up against, right? And part of that is just understanding what the text says we're up against. And a lot of that plays directly into just understanding the Bible well. I think the Bible's awesome, frankly. I think the tradition around the Bible's awesome. And that's what we need to do as Christians, is we need to understand the text. We need to understand what the text says, and we need to understand the history of tradition around the text to help us better understand the text, right? And we do that because it's God's word, and because it's important, and it's beautiful and good and true. And there are transcendent truths to God's ordering of chaos and to God's kind of making sense, to God's defeat of evil powers that go beyond just, I don't know, that go beyond just how we think about it and how our brains kind of process it in kind of in Sunday school or whatever, if that makes sense. I think that the story the Bible's telling is so much bigger than whatever we comprehend it to be, and good biblical theology and good historical theology helps us to understand that. So that's what I would say, why it's important to understand Satan, what he's about, what he's doing, what he's not doing, what different titles are important for accuracy. I think, obviously, there are plenty of people who have written well on Satan and not known all of these different titles, or just not cared to talk about it, the different titles, and just use general terms. But accuracy is good because we're speaking about God's word. And knowing the history of interpretation around this is good so we can better interpret God's word. But that's really how I'm thinking about this content. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be on here, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you for your time. May God bless you, your work, your ministry, future ministry, writing those theological articles. And yeah, I truly hope this book will be beneficial for many pastors, theologians, and young men. I mean, laymen, including it doesn't matter if they're younger or older. But the point is that such a topic, just like so many topics we covered on the channel, with divine council, with other deities, with giants, with just what the gospel is. Once we dedicated a long one episode just to what gospel is. When it comes to defending your faith, when it comes to what cults would be, New Age, when it comes to spiritual warfare, all of these things are the topics and the words we use or read very often, but they take time and money and energy to invest and to learn. And once when you learn to apply, and that it's not always easy, and it's not a fast and a painless process. It's a process that should be required from us as Christians, and it should be we should be diligently trying to study not just the word, but the appropriate context that comes with that. And we're so we're so dissociated from that context as modernists living in 21st century. So yeah, I would recommend this book. Buy it. It is technical. If you can afford it, $45. If not, then just share this material and episode with others. And yeah, we'll see you Friday and Saturday. Ben, may God bless you in your future work and ministry, and continue being faithful to God.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and may God bless each of you watching this live or in the days and weeks to come. Be encouraged. Even when you fall, go back to God. He's faithful. He's not looking with you like this. Be encouraged. Just go to the open arms of the Father. He loves you. And just enjoy his presence. Amen.